Someone who warned today that the PM can't make a mistake when it comes to getting the balance right between sensible stimulus spending and the panic and waste of Kevin Rudd a few years back is the Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly. He joins me now out of Sydney. Well, Paul, I think you nailed it, some sage advice. You nailed it in your column today. This is a fraught area for government, isn't it?
It's incredibly difficult, Peter, because essentially we don't know the impact which this virus will have on the global economy. We don't fully know yet the impact that it will have on the Australian economy, although the Treasury Secretary will be giving us some guidance on that matter tomorrow morning. It's enormously difficult in that sense to get the response right, because the response depends upon the extent of the damage. This will be a decisive moment for Scott Morrison, because this will be a test of his political judgment and his economic assessments. This will be a test of his overall leadership capability. Just as Kevin Rudd's response to the global financial crisis 12 years ago defined Rudd as Prime Minister, and while I appreciate the point that this crisis is not as severe as the global financial crisis, it is nonetheless an international crisis that's affecting this country, and Morrison's response will very much define him as Prime Minister.
Do we have any early indications about the quality of the spending? Because, I mean, it is really easy, and you get pushed a lot of proposals from Treasury to go out there and quickly spend to stimulate the economy, to get money into people's pockets as quickly as you can, and an impetus for them to spend. But often the argument after the spending has occurred that's been a lack of thought with the projects, that they're not necessarily longer term, and that requires a whole lot of shovel-ready projects, particularly from the states, being delivered to the Commonwealth to fund. Do we have a sense of where the money might be spent yet?
Well, we've got some guidance on that, Peter, in terms of the overall approach. Scott Morrison's made it very clear that this won't be a repeat of the Rudd experience when there was an across-the-board, very, very substantial fiscal stimulus. He's ruled that out. He won't go there. So that gives us some guidance in terms of the quantum. It won't be anything like that. Secondly, it'll be targeted. And this reflects the nature of the problem. The problem is not a crisis in the financial system, not a crisis with bank balance sheets. It's a crisis in terms of business and supply chains, and so therefore we'll have a targeted response to particular enterprises and to particular industries. Travel, the export sector, particularly in relation to China, agriculture, infrastructure, construction. So in that sense it'll be quite different again to the response 12 years ago from the Rudd government. But the point I'd make is that because this is a more difficult and a very different sort of crisis, the response is going to be more nuanced and in some senses more challenging to get right. It's easier in one sense to bring down a big conventional across-the-board fiscal stimulus. It's more difficult to bring down economic measures tailored to particular industries and particular enterprises. So I think the degree of difficulty is quite significant here.
Yeah, and of course I think his previous history as a Treasurer will stand him in good stead. Interestingly today, how quickly the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, went out and framed the better-than-expected growth numbers, because he made the point these were obviously playing out in a positive sense before the bushfires hit, before coronavirus really damaged the budget. And I think an attempt there to put aside Labor's claims that the budget was going south anyway and that the government was hiding behind these recent circumstances as a reason for possible downgrading of the surplus. But give me a scorecard. We're not far away now from the end of the first quarter of 2020. We've had sports rorts, bushfires, coronavirus. There's been a whole lot around. How are the both sides travelling, do you think, Paul?
Well, what we've got at the moment, Peter, are completely competing narratives. One from the government, one from the opposition, and these relate to essentially the character and performance and strength of the Prime Minister. Now, if we look at the government story is based around the global crisis, the global health crisis, the global economic crisis, and Morrison being a strong leader responding to this. That is taking very strong measures in terms of health, protecting the safety of Australian citizens, and gearing up to bring down this economic package. So I think overall that is a very good news story for the government. The Prime Minister looks strong, and in that sense I think it is a good result for the government. Then we've got the other narrative. Now the other narrative comes from the Labor Party, and it's about the sports rorts, and essentially the argument is that the Prime Minister can't be trusted, that he's a liar, that he's secretive, that he's deceptive. And Labor continues to run on this, and Labor gives this priority over the economic and health crisis because they think they've got a real chance here to do permanent damage to the Prime Minister. So that's essentially the story after the first 10 weeks or so of politics at the start of this year. So the winning side here will be the narrative that comes through the strongest. So there are very potential upsides here for Morrison if he can get this response right, if he gets the economic response right. On the other hand, if he gets that wrong, and if Labor's narrative prevails, then Labor's got a chance of doing significant damage to the Prime Minister.
And this is where, Paul, things like the Prime Minister's, how would I say it, equivocation on issues like, you know, was Brian Houston invited to the White House by the Prime Minister, or was his name put forward by the Prime Minister's office recently when the trip was there, the official visit with President Trump? Has there been other circumstances where the Prime Minister, who they go to the point of character, they go to his ability, quite cannily Labor does, go to his ability to run a political line as that being the sum total of the man, as opposed to meeting the tests of leadership? That's where they're trying to go, isn't it?
That's absolutely where they're trying to go. And I think just to address the question you've raised, I think Scott Morrison does need to improve the clarity of his public statements. Now, often he's very effective here, but there's no point being equivocal one day and then changing the story the next day, because that just feeds into the Labor narrative. So I think Morrison needs to reflect somewhat on that. I think there's scope for him to improve his public performance simply in terms of clarity and clearness. Certainly, I think one of the interesting features about this is that Labor is making a lot of progress in terms of stamping Scott Morrison as their opponent and in terms of depicting his character. So far the government hasn't been nearly as effective in terms of stamping Anthony Albanese, in terms of how they want to brand the Labor leader, in terms of how they want to damage the Labor leader. Now I guess they've got a lot more time to do that, but one of the interesting features will be when they get to work on that front, exactly how successful they are and what technique they use.
Absolutely, Paul Kelly. And who does the work, because it's something that a leader necessarily can't do. And it's also true that Anthony Albanese is not a new, emerging leader. He's been there for some time. I'm surprised they haven't got his number yet.